The alarm blares at 5 a.m. Your gym clothes are waiting, exactly where you laid them last night. But instead of the energetic jump out of bed you'd imagined, you reach for your phone and hit snooze. Just 5 more minutes, you mumble, knowing full well that tomorrow morning you'll replay this exact same scene. That familiar sting of disappointment settles in as another day of intended change slips away. You're not alone in this struggle. Studies reveal that 80% of people abandon their goals within weeks of setting them, not because they don't want change badly enough, but because they're relying on the wrong power source. Willpower, that mental fuel we've all been taught to depend on, is fundamentally flawed as a strategy for lasting change. It's like trying to illuminate your entire house with a single candle that's constantly being blown by the wind. What neuroscience has uncovered is something far more reliable: the power of systematic discipline, not the rigid, punishment-based discipline you might be picturing, but thoughtfully designed systems that make positive behaviors almost automatic, regardless of how motivated you feel in any given moment. Your brain's motivation circuits fluctuate by design. This biological wiring actively undermines sustained willpower. But there's good news. Science-backed discipline systems can perform consistently, even when your motivation completely disappears. Discipline beats willpower every single time, and here's why. Motivation isn't just an abstract feeling. It's a complex neurochemical process centered around a neurotransmitter you've likely heard of: dopamine. But contrary to popular belief, dopamine isn't simply the pleasure molecule. Neuroscientists now understand it's actually the anticipation of reward, not the reward itself, that triggers dopamine release. This evolutionary mechanism was brilliantly designed for our ancestors' survival. When food was scarce, that dopamine surge motivated the hunt. But here's the critical insight. Once the reward is obtained, dopamine levels naturally drop. Your brain's motivation system wasn't built for sustained effort toward distant goals. It was optimized for immediate survival challenges. Modern brain imaging studies show this vividly. When participants first imagine achieving their goals, their nucleus accumbens, a key pleasure center, lights up with activity. This creates that familiar rush of motivation we all experience when starting something new. But as Stanford neurobiologist Andrew Huberman explains, this initial neurochemical cascade is biologically unsustainable over long periods. This explains why willpower consistently fails us. Willpower depends on that fluctuating dopamine system, which exhausts itself through a phenomenon scientists call ego depletion. Imagine your willpower as a muscle. It strengthens with use, but fatigue is inevitable. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that decision-making itself drains this limited resource. Every choice you face throughout your day, from what to wear to whether you should exercise, gradually depletes your willpower reserves. Your prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for self-control and executive function, requires significant glucose to operate. As this energy depletes, your brain conserves resources by defaulting to habitual behaviors rather than consciously chosen ones. This isn't a moral failing. It's your biology working exactly as designed. Evolution prioritized energy conservation over consistent long-term goal pursuit. This biological reality creates what psychologists call the motivation gap, that frustrating space between knowing what to do and actually doing it consistently. You experience this gap when you understand perfectly well that exercising is beneficial, yet still struggle to make it happen regularly. The gap exists not because you lack information or desire, but because you're attempting to power long-term behavior with a short-term biological system. Interestingly, neuroimaging studies of highly disciplined individuals reveal something remarkable. When faced with temptation, their brains show significantly less activity in the regions associated with conflict and decision-making. This doesn't mean they have superhuman willpower. Rather, they've reduced their reliance on willpower altogether by developing systems that minimize decision points. As researcher Benjamin Hardy notes in his work on willpower, the people we view as disciplined aren't successfully fighting temptation. They're successfully avoiding it through environmental design. Their secret isn't stronger motivation, but strategically structured discipline systems that work with their brain's natural tendencies rather than against them. This biological mismatch between our ancient motivation systems and modern goals has led to persistent myths about willpower and discipline. These misconceptions don't just mislead us, they actively sabotage our efforts at lasting change. Perhaps the most damaging myth is what psychologists call the motivation fallacy. The belief that successful people simply have more motivation or willpower than others. We see someone consistently working out at 5 a.m. and assume they must wake up bursting with enthusiasm every morning. This fundamental misattribution ignores the invisible systems and habits that actually drive their consistency. The social media highlight reel amplifies this misconception. We witness the triumphant marathon finish, but not the mundane training schedule that made it possible. We see the successful business launch, but not the daily routines that sustained its development. This creates an unrealistic expectation that achievement should feel consistently inspiring and energizing, when the neuroscience clearly shows otherwise. Another pervasive myth is what researchers call arrival fallacy, the belief that motivation will suddenly appear once you've started. "I'll start Monday." Thinking reflects this misconception, assuming future you will somehow have resources that present you lacks. But the research is clear. Motivation typically follows action, not the other way around. The consistent gym goer doesn't necessarily feel motivated before each workout. Their established routine carries them through, regardless of fluctuating feelings. Modern technology exacerbates these motivational challenges. Your devices are specifically engineered to hijack your dopamine systems, creating what addiction expert Anna Lemke calls dopamine overload. Each notification, like, and scroll delivers a tiny dopamine hit, training your brain to expect immediate rewards. This conditions your neural circuitry to resist the delayed gratification required for meaningful achievements. The contrast is striking. Modern digital design rewards distraction with instant dopamine, while most worthwhile goals require delayed gratification. Your brain, flooded with easily accessible dopamine triggers, becomes increasingly resistant to activities offering slower, more meaningful rewards. This isn't just making you distracted, it's actively rewiring your motivation pathways to prefer immediate gratification. Self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Dacey and Richard Ryan, offers crucial insight into another motivation myth, that external rewards build lasting motivation. Their research demonstrates that while extrinsic motivators, like money or praise, can boost short-term performance, they actually undermine intrinsic motivation over time. Each external reward subtly shifts your perceived locus of control from internal to external, making you more dependent on outside validation rather than less. What makes these myths particularly destructive is how they cultivate shame around normal motivation fluctuations. When you believe the myth that successful people maintain constant motivation, your inevitable energy dips feel like personal failures rather than normal biological patterns. This shame creates additional emotional burden, further depleting the limited willpower you're trying to strengthen. The research of psychologist Carol Dweck illuminates another critical misunderstanding, seeing motivation as a fixed trait rather than a cultivated skill. Her work on growth mindset reveals that people who view their abilities as developable rather than fixed demonstrate significantly more persistence. The myth that motivation is something you either have or don't have creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of surrender when motivation naturally wanes. These misconceptions persist because they align with our intuitive understanding of how motivation should work. They feel true, even as the evidence contradicts them. Recognizing them as myths, not personal shortcomings, creates space for a more effective approach based on behavioral systems rather than emotional states. So what's the alternative? While most people chase the wrong solution, trying to increase their willpower or find some magical source of endless motivation, highly effective individuals take a fundamentally different approach. They create discipline systems that bypass willpower limitations entirely. Consider the difference between motivation-dependent exercise and a disciplined approach. The motivation-dependent person decides each day whether they feel like working out. Some days they do, most days they don't. Their success depends entirely on their fluctuating emotional state. The disciplined person, however, removes the decision point entirely. They don't ask themselves whether they feel like exercising. It's simply what happens at 6 a.m. on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The difference isn't in their motivation levels, but in their decision-making framework. This system-based approach aligns perfectly with the neurological reality we explored earlier. By removing decision points, you conserve the limited glucose your prefrontal cortex needs for self-control. Each pre-made decision is one less opportunity for willpower depletion. As psychologist Daniel Kahneman explains in his work on decision fatigue, the best decision makers aren't those with the most willpower. They're those who structure their lives to require fewer willpower-depleting choices. Implementation intentions represent one of the most powerful discipline systems available. Rather than vague goals like exercise more, these are precise if-then plans. If it's 7 a.m. on Tuesday, then I go to the gym regardless of how I feel. Research by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer shows that implementation intentions dramatically increase follow-through by up to 300% in some studies. The reason is neurologically sound. They convert conscious, energy-intensive decisions into automated behavioral triggers. Environmental design provides another powerful system for bypassing willpower limitations. Your physical environment constantly shapes your behavior through unconscious cues. A Stanford University study found that simply placing healthy options at eye level in refrigerators doubled vegetable consumption without any additional motivation or education. The participants didn't need more willpower. They needed strategically structured choices. This environmental approach aligns with what Harvard psychologist B.J. Fogg calls behavior design. Fogg's research demonstrates that making desired behaviors easier to perform has a far greater impact than increasing motivation. Reducing friction by even small amounts yields dramatic behavior changes. Want to floss more? Place the floss directly on top of your toothbrush. Want to practice guitar? Leave it on a stand in your living room rather than in its case. These tiny adjustments bypass the need for motivation by eliminating activation energy. The neurological foundation for these systems resides in our habit formation circuits. When behaviors become habitual, they shift from your prefrontal cortex, which requires conscious energy, to your basal ganglia, which operates automatically. Neuroscientist Anne Graybiel's research with MIT shows this process physically alters neural pathways, creating what she calls chunking, the brain's way of packaging complex routines into single, automated units that require minimal conscious oversight. This explains why disciplined individuals don't appear to struggle with the same temptations as others. It's not superior motivation, it's superior systems. Their habits operate through different neural pathways entirely, bypassing the willpower-intensive regions altogether. Their discipline isn't constantly tested because their environment and routines remove most decision points where willpower would be needed. Identity-based motivation represents perhaps the most powerful discipline system of all. Psychologist James Clear's research shows that when behaviors become linked to identity, to who you believe yourself to be, they become dramatically more consistent. The shift from "I want to exercise" to "I am someone who exercises" changes the fundamental question from "Do I feel like doing this?" to "What would someone like me do in this situation?" This identity-based approach creates an internal consistency that transcends fluctuating motivation states. The impact of relying on willpower extends far beyond just failed goals. It creates measurable physical and emotional strain. Each time you force yourself to do something through sheer willpower, your body activates its stress response system, releasing cortisol into your bloodstream. This hormone is beneficial in acute situations, but becomes damaging when chronically elevated. Stanford health psychologist Kelly McGonigal has documented how willpower-based self-control triggers the same physiological stress response as facing external threats. Your body doesn't distinguish between forcing yourself to work on a project when exhausted and facing a physical danger. Both activate your hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. Over time, this repeated stress activation contributes to inflammation, immune suppression, and even cardiovascular strain. The emotional toll is equally significant. Psychologists call it willpower backlash, the psychological rebound that occurs when suppression-based willpower inevitably fails. You've likely experienced this. After rigidly controlling your eating through willpower, a single moment of giving in often leads to a complete abandonment of restraint. This isn't weakness. It's a predictable neurological response to prolonged self-control demands. This willpower backlash creates a particularly damaging cycle. Each failure reinforces your belief that you lack discipline, which increases emotional distress, which further depletes your already limited willpower resources. The research of psychologist Roy Baumeister confirms this destructive pattern. Emotional distress significantly impairs self-regulation abilities, creating a downward spiral where each failure makes the next one more likely. Decision fatigue, the diminishing quality of decisions after making many of them, represents another hidden cost of willpower dependence. A remarkable study of parole judges found that prisoners who appeared early in the day received parole about 70% of the time, while those with identical cases who appeared late in the day were granted parole less than 10% of the time. The judges' decision-making ability literally degraded throughout the day as their cognitive resources depleted. This same pattern affects every area of your life. As your day progresses, each willpower-demanding decision reduces your capacity to make good choices later. This explains why health goals often collapse in the evening. You've exhausted your willpower reserves earlier in the day. By evening, your biology naturally shifts toward conserving energy, making high willpower choices increasingly difficult. The impact extends to creativity and problem-solving ability as well. When your cognitive resources are consumed by willpower demands, you have less mental bandwidth available for innovative thinking. Neuroscientific research shows that creative insights typically emerge when the brain's default mode network can operate without excessive conscious control, precisely what becomes impossible under constant willpower strain. Even your interpersonal relationships suffer under willpower dependence. After periods of high self-control exertion, people exhibit increased aggression and reduced empathy. The same willpower resources needed for emotional regulation get depleted through other self-control tasks, leaving you with less capacity for patience and understanding in your interactions with others. Disciplined systems, by contrast, reduce this physiological and psychological burden dramatically. When behaviors operate through habit rather than conscious self-control, they don't trigger the same stress response or deplete cognitive resources. A morning run that happens through established routine rather than willpower-driven effort doesn't create the cortisol spike or cognitive depletion of a willpower-dependent activity. This explains why truly disciplined individuals often appear more balanced and less stressed than those constantly fighting themselves through willpower. Their systems-based approach conserves both physical and emotional resources by removing the internal struggle that willpower dependence creates. The neurological and psychological evidence is clear. Systems beat willpower every time. But transforming this insight into daily practice requires a strategic approach, one that works with your brain's natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. At its core, building discipline is about architecting your environment and routines to make the right behaviors inevitable. Behavioral scientists call this choice architecture, deliberately designing your surroundings so disciplined decisions become the path of least resistance. Instead of exhausting yourself with constant resistance, simply remove the obstacles. Struggling with social media distractions? Delete the apps from your phone rather than battling the urge to check them hourly. Finding it hard to exercise consistently? Sleep in your workout clothes and place your running shoes by the door. Each environmental adjustment creates a channel for desired behaviors while damming the flow toward unwanted ones. This environmental design pairs perfectly with implementation intentions, precise if-then frameworks that transform vague aspirations into automatic action triggers. When you create specific plans like, if it's Monday at 7 p.m., I'll review my week's priorities, you're 91% more likely to follow through than someone with equal motivation but no concrete plan. These simple, when X happens, I will do Y formulas bypass the decision fatigue that normally drains willpower, converting conscious choices into almost reflexive responses. Your existing habits offer another powerful foundation for discipline through habit stacking. Rather than forcing entirely new neural pathways, you can graft new behaviors onto established routines. After brushing your teeth, do 10 push-ups. After pouring your morning coffee, write 3 sentences of your novel. These connections leverage the momentum of existing habits, dramatically reducing the activation energy needed to sustain consistency when motivation inevitably fades. Small wins adds up. Your brain's reward circuitry activates with each achievement, releasing dopamine that reinforces behavior patterns. By breaking larger goals into tiny, achievable tasks, you create frequent opportunities for this neurochemical reinforcement. The writer who commits to just 50 words daily instead of vaguely planning to write a book creates consistent neurological reward patterns while avoiding the overwhelm that triggers procrastination. These seemingly modest commitments compound into remarkable results, not through bursts of motivation, but through the steady accumulation of small victories. When internal systems alone aren't enough, external accountability creates the social scaffolding necessary for sustained discipline. Commitment to another person increases your follow-through probability by 65%, while scheduling specific accountability check-ins pushes success rates to an astonishing 95%. This isn't about finding motivation. It's about engineering social consequences that your brain takes seriously even when your intrinsic drive has temporarily vanished. Perhaps the most transformative discipline strategy lies in identity-based reinforcement. Instead of focusing exclusively on behaviors, cultivate an identity where those behaviors would naturally emerge. Ask yourself, who is the type of person who could achieve this goal? Then systematically strengthen that identity through language, visualization, and consistent aligned actions. Research consistently shows that identity-based motivation creates substantially more behavioral consistency than focusing on outcomes alone. Throughout this discipline-building process, measurement systems provide the essential feedback loops that sustain progress. What gets measured improves, not because measurement increases motivation, but because it illuminates patterns that would otherwise operate below conscious awareness. The simple act of tracking creates what psychologists call the Hawthorne effect, the tendency for behavior to improve simply by virtue of being observed. Whether through habit trackers, progress journals, or data logs, these measurement systems maintain awareness without requiring constant willpower. The true power in these strategies lies in their independence from your fluctuating emotional states. Unlike willpower-based approaches that collapse when motivation naturally ebbs, these systems continue functioning regardless of how you feel on any given day. They represent the fundamental shift from seeing discipline as a personality trait to understanding it as an environmental and systematic reality, one you can deliberately engineer to achieve remarkable consistency in any area of your life. The distinction between willpower and discipline isn't just academic. It's the difference between perpetual struggle and sustainable success. Where willpower demands constant energy to fight against your natural tendencies, discipline systems work with your biology to make the right choices inevitable. The science is unambiguous. Your brain's motivation systems evolved for short-term survival challenges, not modern long-term goals. By continuing to rely on these fluctuating motivation circuits, you're setting yourself up for an endless cycle of enthusiastic starts and disappointed finishes. Discipline systems, through environmental design, implementation intentions, habit stacking, and identity reinforcement, create a path that functions regardless of how you feel on any given day. This approach doesn't just lead to better results, it fundamentally transforms the experience of achievement from exhausting willpower battles to relatively effortless consistency. The most accomplished people aren't those with superhuman motivation, but those who've built systems making discipline their default state, rather than a constant struggle. As you implement these strategies in your own life, remember that discipline itself is a system to be built, not a trait to be wished for. Your future success doesn't depend on wanting it more. It depends on designing it better. If you found value in understanding why discipline beats willpower every time, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment with which discipline strategy you're going to implement first. Remember, the difference between where you are and where you want to be isn't motivation, it's your systems. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and join our community of lifelong learners. Like to stay updated with new insights. Comment on what personal growth topics you'd like us to explore next.